February 1st, 1960. Four college freshmen walk into a Woolworth's department store in Greensboro, North Carolina. They buy a few items: toothpaste, notebooks, small things. Get their receipts. Then they walk to the lunch counter, sit down, and order coffee. The waitress looks at them, looks at the manager, looks back at them, and says, "We don't serve Negroes here." The four young men, Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, didn't move. They placed their receipts on the counter. "We just purchased items at this store," one of them says quietly. "We'd like to be served at this counter." The waitress walks away. The manager approaches, threatens them, walks away. The police arrive, stand there, do nothing because technically no law is being broken. And the four students just sit. For hours. They don't yell, don't argue, don't fight. They just refuse to leave. By the end of the week, thousands had joined them. By the end of the month, sit-ins had spread to 15 cities across 5 states. Within 6 months, the lunch counters were desegregated. But hear what nobody tells you. At the time, these students were condemned. Not just by segregationists, by moderates, by newspapers, by people who said they supported equality, just not like this. They were called troublemakers, agitators, lawbreakers. Martin Luther King Jr. himself wasn't even sure this was the right move at first. So here's the question. If the law says you can't sit somewhere because of your skin color, is breaking that law immoral? Or is obeying it? And if sitting quietly in a chair becomes an act of rebellion, what does that tell us about power? Today we're going deep into one of the most misunderstood moments in American history. A story that's been sanitized, simplified, turned into a feel-good tale about progress. But the truth is messier than that, and far more useful. If you've ever wondered when breaking the law becomes a moral duty, this might be where that question crystallized. Subscribe if you want the full story, not the version they tell you to make you comfortable. All right, let's go back to an America that was perfectly legal and completely unjust. Hear what most people don't understand. In 1960, segregation wasn't some relic of the distant past. It was the law. Not just in the South, everywhere that mattered. If you were black in America, your entire existence was defined by where you couldn't go. You couldn't eat at most restaurants, couldn't drink from most water fountains, couldn't use most bathrooms, couldn't sit in most waiting rooms, couldn't swim in most pools, couldn't sleep in most hotels. And if you violated these rules, you could be arrested, beaten, or killed. This wasn't hidden, it was policy. Signs everywhere, whites only, colored entrance, no Negroes allowed. And the cruelty wasn't just the separation. It was the humiliation baked into every transaction. A black family could walk into a store, spend money, support the business, but couldn't sit at the lunch counter. They could buy a sandwich to go, stand outside and eat it in the heat or the rain. But they couldn't sit, because sitting implied equality. And equality was unthinkable. Now here's the part that made it all sustainable. Most white Americans didn't think they were being cruel. They thought they were maintaining order, preserving tradition, protecting civilization. When black activists pushed for change, white moderates said the same thing over and over. "We agree with your goals, but not your methods. Change takes time. You're moving too fast. You're making things worse." Even white people who consider themselves progressive often opposed direct action. They wanted gradual reform, legal challenges, patience. They wanted black Americans to wait. And black Americans had been waiting for generations. Hear what rarely gets mentioned. The waiting wasn't passive. It was strategic suppression disguised as civility. By 1960, 4 young college students had had enough of waiting. But they didn't start a riot. They did something far more dangerous. They sat down. And what made them think that would actually work? That's next. As L. Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil, freshmen at North Carolina A&T State University, a historically black college. They weren't activists, weren't connected to any major organization. They were just students. But they'd been talking. Late nights in the dorm, conversations about dignity, about manhood, about shame. McNeil later described a moment that stuck with him. He'd been traveling by bus, stopped at a rest stop, hungry. Walked up to the counter to order food. The woman behind the counter looked at him and said, "We don't serve your kind." He was 17 years old, and something inside him broke. Not into rage, into clarity. He realized this isn't sustainable, this can't be how we live. So he and his friends started planning. They studied the philosophy of nonviolence, read Gandhi, read about the Montgomery bus boycott. But they also studied the economics. Because here's what they understood, and this is the part most retellings miss. Businesses didn't care about morality. They cared about money. Woolworth's lunch counter made a profit by serving white customers. But what if black customers who already shopped at Woolworth sat at that counter and refused to leave? What if they occupied every seat? White customers wouldn't sit next to them. Woolworth would lose business. The longer the sit-in lasted, the more money Woolworths lost. Nonviolence wasn't just a moral stance. It was strategic pressure. It was economic coercion with a smile. On the evening of January 31st, 1960, the 4 students made a pact. Tomorrow we sit. No violence, no shouting. We dress well, we're polite, we bring our schoolwork. And we don't leave until we're served. They knew they might be arrested. They knew they might be beat. They went anyway. And the next day, everything changed. But not in the way you'd expect. February 1st, 1960, 4:30 p.m. The 4 students walk into Woolworth's. They're wearing their best clothes, shirts and ties neat, respectable. They buy small items, establish that they're paying customers. Then they sit at the lunch counter. And they wait. The waitress refuses to serve them. The manager arrives, tells them to leave. They stay. He threatens to call the police. They stay. The police arrive. Stand there confused. Because technically, the students aren't breaking any law by sitting. Woolworth could refuse service, but the students aren't causing a disturbance. They're just sitting, reading textbooks, doing homework. Polite, quiet, immovable. The store closes at 5:30 p.m. The students leave peacefully, and they come back the next day. This time, more students join them. By day 3, it's not just 4 students. It's dozens. By day 4, it's hundreds. White students from nearby colleges start joining in solidarity. The lunch counter is completely occupied. Woolworth is hemorrhaging money. And the media shows up. Cameras, reporters, national attention. Suddenly, this isn't just a local issue. This is a story. And once the story spreads, the sit-in model spreads with it. Within days, students in other cities start their own sit-ins. Durham, Raleigh, Charlotte. Then Nashville, Atlanta, Richmond. By the end of February, 15 cities across 5 states have active sit-ins. Thousands of students, all sitting, all refusing to leave. And the response from white America? Not what you'd expect. In fact, it's the response that tells us more about power than the protest itself. Hear what happened when the sit-ins spread. Violence, not from the students, from the people who wanted them gone. In some cities, white crowds gathered at the lunch counters, screaming, spitting, throwing food, pouring drinks on the students' heads, burning them with cigarettes. And the students sat there, didn't fight back, didn't leave. In Nashville, a mob attacked sit-in participants, pulled them off stools, beat them. The police arrested the students, not the attackers, the students, for disturbing the peace. But here, where it gets more insidious, the harshest criticism didn't come from the KKK or open segregationists. It came from moderates. Newspaper editorials condemned the protests, called the students immature, said they were damaging race relations, said change needed to happen through proper legal channels, not disruption. One editorial in a North Carolina paper said, "The sit-ins are regrettable. They create tension and ill will." Notice the framing. Not segregation is regrettable. Not denying someone service because of their race creates tension. The protest was the problem, not the injustice. Even some black leaders were uncomfortable. They worried the students were moving too fast, that they'd provoke white backlash, that it would make things worse. But the students didn't stop, because they'd figured something out that most people still don't understand. Comfort was the enemy of change. As long as segregation was orderly, it would persist forever. But if segregation became expensive, embarrassing, and disruptive, it would end. And they were right. By July 1960, just 6 months after the first sit-in, Woolworth desegregated its lunch counters. Not because they had a moral awakening, because it was costing them too much money to keep fighting. But the question lingered. Were the sit-ins civil disobedience? Or were they just breaking the law? And that question, whether we like it or not, is still being fought over today. Pause for a second. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If the law protects an injustice, is obeying that law moral? And if breaking that law is the only way to expose the injustice, is it justified? Now flip it. If a group of people disrupts private businesses, refuses to leave when asked, and costs those businesses money, are they protesters or criminals? Because here's the thing. At the time, most Americans, including many who opposed segregation, thought the sit-ins were wrong. Not because they supported racism, but because they believed in order, in process, in respecting the law, even if the law was unjust. So here's the question. Were the Greensboro Four breaking the law or exposing it? Drop a comment, be honest. Because this isn't a historical question. It's happening right now. Climate protests, blocking highways, occupying buildings. Same debate, same tension. When does protest become illegitimate disruption? And who gets to decide? Think about that while we keep going. Because what happened after the sit-in succeeded is where the story gets rewritten. And the rewrite might be more dangerous than the original backlash. Here, where things get strange. The sit-ins worked. Lunch counters desegregated. Civil rights legislation eventually passed. And America took a collective breath and said, "See, the system works. Peaceful protest wins." And then the story got sanitized. Textbooks started teaching the sit-ins as a feel-good tale. Brave students, moral clarity, inevitable progress. The discomfort erased. The economic pressure barely mentioned. The fact that most white Americans opposed the sit-ins at the time, forgotten. Instead, the narrative became, nonviolent protest is always the right way to create change. Which sounds nice, but it misses the point entirely. The sit-ins weren't gentle persuasion. They were economic coercion. They didn't change hearts and minds. They changed the cost-benefit analysis. Woolworth didn't desegregate because they suddenly realized racism was wrong. They desegregated because keeping the lunch counter segregated was bleeding them dry. But admitting that creates a problem. Because if we admit that disruption, not persuasion, drove change, then we have to reckon with the fact that the same tactics are being used today. And we might not like them. So instead, we tell a simpler story. Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech. Rosa Parks sat on a bus. Students sat at a counter, and racism ended. Peaceful, polite, palatable. But that story is a lie. Or at least a very convenient edit. Because the students weren't trying to be palatable. They were trying to be undeniable. And it worked. But only because they made people uncomfortable. And only because they refused to stop. Here, what most people never learn. The sanitized version of the sit-ins serves power better than the real version ever could. Which brings us to the strangest part of this story. How the sit-ins became a symbol that means completely different things to different people. And why that difference matters more now than it did in 1960. Fast forward to today. The Greensboro sit-in is taught in every American history class. There's a museum at the site. The lunch counter itself is in the Smithsonian. It's been turned into a symbol of American progress. Proof that the system works. That peaceful protest achieves justice. But here's the irony. The same people who celebrate the Greensboro Four often condemn modern protesters using the exact same tactics. Climate activists blocking pipelines. They're breaking the law. They should protest peacefully. Black Lives Matter protesters occupying streets. This isn't the way. They're making people angry. Pro-Palestine students occupying university buildings. They're criminals. This is disruption, not protest. Same tactic, same structure, same goal. Make the injustice so visible, so disruptive, so expensive that ignoring it becomes impossible. But somehow, when it happened in 1960, it's heroic. When it happens now, it's illegitimate. Why? Because we've rewritten the sit-ins to fit a narrative we're comfortable with. We've turned them into a story about good people patiently waiting for bad people to realize they were wrong. But that's not what happened. The students didn't wait for moral enlightenment. They forced an economic reckoning. And they were hated for it. Polls from 1960 show that most Americans, including many who opposed segregation, disapproved of the sit-ins. They thought the students were going too far, moving too fast, causing unnecessary tension. Sound familiar? The exact same criticisms leveled at protesters today were leveled at the Greensboro Four. But we've forgotten that, because remembering it would mean admitting something uncomfortable. The protesters we celebrate in history were just as disruptive, just as controversial, and just as condemned as the protesters we criticize today. The only difference: time and who won. Which raises a question we can't avoid anymore. Let's sit with the uncomfortable reality. The Greensboro Four broke the rules. Not the law technically, but the social order. They made white customers uncomfortable. They cost Woolworths money. They disrupted business. And they did it intentionally. That's not a criticism, it's a fact. Because disruption was the point. Segregation was sustainable as long as it was comfortable. As long as white customers could eat lunch without confronting the moral cost. The sit-ins made that impossible. They forced white Americans to choose. Sit next to black people or don't eat here. Support segregation actively or let it crumble. There was no neutral position anymore. And that's what made the sit-ins so effective. Not kindness, not persuasion. Discomfort. But here, where it gets complicated. If we celebrate the sit-ins for being disruptive, then we have to ask, when is disruption justified? When does protest cross the line into chaos? Because not every disruptive protest is righteous. Not every act of civil disobedience is moral. The sit-ins worked because the cause was just. Because segregation was indefensible. Because the students were disciplined, strategic, and morally grounded. But what about protests we disagree with? What about causes we think are wrong? Do they get to disrupt too? And who decides which disruptions are legitimate and which are? Here's the truth. We can't have it both ways. We can't celebrate the Greensboro Four for breaking norms and then condemn modern protesters for doing the same thing. Either disruption is a valid tool of protest, or it is. Either civil disobedience is justified when the law is unjust, or it's not. You don't get to pick and choose based on whether you agree with the cause. The Greensboro Four didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for consensus. They sat down, refused to move, and forced the issue. And it worked, but only because they were willing to endure hatred, violence, and arrest. Only because they understood that comfort is the enemy of change. And only because they believed that some injustices are worth disrupting the peace to end. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that nonviolence always wins, but that change requires cost, and someone has to be willing to pay it. So what do we do with that now? So where does this leave us? Every year, we teach students about the Greensboro sit-ins. We tell them it's a story about courage, about justice, about peaceful protest. And it is. But it's also a story about disruption, about economic pressure, about making injustice so uncomfortable that ignoring it becomes impossible. The students didn't win because they were polite. They won because they refused to leave. And that's the part we don't like to talk about. Because if we admit that disruption works, we have to reckon with the fact that protesters today are using the exact same playbook. And we might not like their cause. We might not like their tactics. We might wish they'd protest more quietly, more conveniently. But that's exactly what people said about the Greensboro Four. The students weren't celebrated in 1960. They were condemned, called troublemakers, criminals, agitators. It's only now, 60 years later, that we call them heroes. So here's the question we're left with. If the protesters we celebrate in history were controversial in their time, how do we know which of today's protesters will be celebrated tomorrow? And which will be forgotten? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the same questions keep coming back. When is breaking the law a moral duty? When does disruption become necessary? And who gets to decide what counts as legitimate protest? These aren't historical questions. They're questions we're living with right now. If this made you see the sit-ins differently, or if it made you uncomfortable, good, share it. Send it to someone who thinks protest should always be convenient. Send it to someone who's never questioned why we celebrate old protests but condemn new ones. And if you want more stories that challenge how we remember history, subscribe. We're not here to make you comfortable. We're here to make you think. This is the story of the Greensboro sit-in. But really, it's about all of us. About how we decide which rules are worth breaking, which disruptions are justified, and whether we're willing to be as uncomfortable as the change we say we want requires. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. And remember, the protesters we celebrate today were the troublemakers of yesterday.